Good afternoon, everyone. So I have the privilege of getting you right after lunch, and if you're anything like me, you are digesting and getting tired right now. So hopefully this will be interactive and good for you. We really want this information to be relevant. And so although we're calling this a plenary, it's very much based in some small group conversations with you and the people sitting right around you, and then some large group share out. So here's your agenda. We're going to start out by diving into some theory. So has anyone here heard of Richard Elmore, Harvard professor, wrote Instructional Rounds? Okay, great. We're going to dive into some excerpts from that book. After that, we're going to establish and agree on some criteria for evidence. And then finally, we're going to start applying it. So we're going to play an evidence game where you have to identify if something is or is not evidence. And then we'll align that to the instructional practices. After that, you will go into your breakout groups and actually conduct an observation of a teacher via a video lesson. And so that is what we're doing today. And so right now, what I want to ask you to do is I want to ask you to open your handouts, and open your handouts to page 3. So we're about to read excerpts from one chapter of this book. And Instructional Rounds is one of those books that's really been transformative in education. It was written by Liz City and Richard Elmore. And so we are going to dive into one chapter, which is called Learning to See, Unlearning to Judge. And Elmore in this chapter talks a lot about how when we walk into classrooms, kind of one of our predilections as educators is to say, all right, that's a good classroom, or that's a not so good classroom. And even though we might have the skill set to make some judgments like that, it's really impeding us in providing exceptional feedback. It means that we're not really looking at evidence, we're looking at our judgments. And so Elmore's really saying, how can we step away from our judgments, those conclusions that we're making about classrooms, and really get to as low inference as possible, to really get to the evidence. And that's what this is about. So now we're going to establish criteria for evidence. In the parts that you didn't read from Elmore, I'm summarizing them for you up here. And before we jump into what is evidence, let's look at what it is not. And so, right here is opinion. And although we learned in elementary school the difference between fact and opinion, we're going to see that when we look at Elmore's definition or his criteria for evidence, that it's a little bit more expansive than just fact. So here, what evidence is not. Evidence is not opinion. It's not interpretation. Saying things like a teacher clearly did this. Well, it's clear to you, but it might not be clear to the students, and that's who they're actually serving. Right? Or students work well together. What's your evidence for that? How do you know that the students worked well together? That's what we're looking for you to write down in your notes. If we write down that the content must be wrong for this age group, that's really high up on the ladder of inference. On the bottom rung would be students are learning vocabulary of 2-syllable words. Right? You can make your judgment later, but that's the evidence. That's the low inference. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding opinion. If you remember it, I'll come back to you. Thank you. So here's what Liz City and Richard Elmore are saying about evidence. They're saying a couple of really key things. First, it must be descriptive, fine-grained, and useful. We don't have to write that the teacher wrote on the board in green marker if that doesn't matter. If green is verbs and yellow is nouns, then it matters. Right? But if it's not useful, we don't have to use it. Then focus on what are teachers doing and saying, what are students doing and saying, and what's the task? We always want to stay in a descriptive and not the judging mode. Once I collect all my low inference notes, I take my evidence, I align it to a rubric. I'm not making a judgment. The rubric's actually doing that for me. So Danielson is making a judgment based on the evidence that I bring to the rubric. And then finally, to remember to document what we see in a classroom environment, not just having our heads down into the keyboard in a computer, but also looking up and seeing what's happening around us. Here in Philadelphia, it's 3 quick things to remember. So we can use this as our own rubric, as our own internal criteria. Is it non-judgmental? Is it specific? And does it define what was seen, said, or done? I see some of you writing this down. That's great, but I promise you by the end of today, you will have these memorized. So we're going to play a quick game. We're going to put up a piece of evidence. You see it in front of you. You have the 3 criteria. And my question to you is, does this meet our criteria for evidence or not? And let's do this first one together. So the teacher asks lots of high-level questions. What do you think? Okay, what's the issue? Lack of specificity, right? Also, lots is an opinion. I think lots is 5. You need 25 to be lots. So yes, this is no. So the next one. Students are discussing in groups of 3 the concept of village. One asks the other 2, are you sure it's like a town? Yes. One thing about quotes, if it's a quote, it is almost always going to be evidence because you're literally taking what they said. You cannot, it's not controversial, right? You might not agree with what they said, but the actual quote is direct evidence.
That's actually great when the children give the wrong answer and the teacher accepts it as the correct answer. It's a great way to capture, that kind of evidence.
And if in a feedback conversation we say, you gave the wrong answer to the students, if I'm that teacher that you're giving that feedback to, I'm likely to get a little bit defensive. But if you instead say, here's a piece of evidence that I heard in your classroom, then I have to own that. I'm less likely to become defensive about a judgment you just made about me. Thank you. So now we're going to make it a little bit more complicated and add the lens of the instructional practices or the Common Core. So please open up to pages 8 or 9 in your handout. 8 and 9. So pages 8 and 9 include all of the instructional practices. And the eventual goal of collecting evidence is that we're not just collecting evidence, but then we're classifying it according to a framework. And sometimes that framework is Danielson if it's evaluation. Sometimes it is the instructional practices. And so what we want to do is we want to get that practice right now at being able to classify our evidence according to the instructional practices. So right now, I'm going to bring up another evidence statement. We're going to do the same thing of determining is this evidence or not, but then we're also going to figure out which instructional practice does it align to. And so what I want to ask you to do is work with someone next to you and answer 2 questions. Number 1, is it evidence? Does it meet our criteria? And then number 2, if so, which instructional practice would you align it to? And take 2 minutes for that, please. First off, by a show of hands, your thumbs up or down, is it evidence? Yes, we agree it's evidence. Okay, so now dig in. Which of the instructional practices does it relate to? Okay, we agree too. Curriculum-driven opportunities to determine the meaning of general and domain-specific words, right? We're talking about vocabulary even though it's prefix, so we're not talking about complex vocabulary. Let's go to another one. Students were unclear about the objective of the social studies activity. Thumbs up or thumbs down? Okay, so if we ever have to ask this question, how do you know? It's not evidence. Because the answer to the question, how do you know, is the evidence, right? So students were unclear about the objective of the social studies activity. No. How do you know that that's not evidence? What's the actual evidence? What would you expect to see for actual evidence here? I'll share what she said. That the kids don't know what's happening. That they raise their hand and say, what are we doing? That they look confused and they go like this. Okay? So that is more of the evidence. That's how we know. So today we're doing a session on high-impact feedback, and this is heavily related to what we did last Wednesday on observation. And today, both in the feedback session, the plenary that we're doing now, as well as the breakout session that you do with your assistant superintendent a little bit after this in the afternoon, we're going to rely heavily on what we discussed back on Wednesday, thinking about our criteria for evidence, thinking about that ladder of inference and wanting to be on the bottom rung of the ladder. And all of that is extremely important, not only in observation, but the whole kind of prize, which is the feedback. The observation we just see as the prereq for the feedback. We're changing the process up, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to analyze an article. We're not going to read the whole thing. It's coming from Educational Leadership, which comes out of ASCD, and it's called Feedback for Learning. Who here has heard of Grant Wiggins? All right, what's he famous for? Yeah, UVD, right? So Understanding by Design. And in Understanding by Design, Grant Wiggins is also thinking about feedback to students or feedback to teachers. So the article that we're about to dig into is devoid of age group. It is about feedback whether you are a kindergartner or whether you are a 50th year principal. So here's what we're doing. Please go to page 6 in your handouts.
I would just also push that with the informals, it's really valuable to give the descriptive feedback, and as soon as we attach a number to it, the teachers stop reading. So being able to not formally grade on the informals is a really valuable way to work with teachers, and so I think that's an additional reason to keep the NA specifically just with the informals.
So this, Thank you. This issue of wanting to be able to provide narrative feedback without attaching a number to it, and I could see that especially at certain times in the year you want to do that because you're creating a relationship with a teacher or you don't want people to get obsessive over the number. Okay, so let me give you my opinion, and then I absolutely know that you can make your own decisions about this. So my opinion is this. My opinion is that there are certainly times to give feedback to teachers without numbers. There is a walkthrough tool. It's based on the instructional practices. It doesn't have numbers in it, right? But if you want to give feedback on something in Danielson, you're being asked to assign a number. So two things. Number one is if you really don't want to assign a number, I might say, just do it in Word document and pass them the feedback that you want to do, right? Or have a conversation with them and do you need to document this in EDS? That's the first one. The second one is effectiveness theory is saying we're using rubrics for a reason. When I started teaching in Houston, Texas, and my first evaluation was a checklist, and it was literally 8 things. Did I have a decorated bulletin board? Did I use technology? And I got a check because I turned on my overhead projector. It was things like that. Is my classroom clean? And it was yes or no. It was dichotomized. And effectiveness theory is saying that these things are not yes or no. They're on a continuum. Right? I don't just say an objective or I don't. There's different qualities of it, right? I might make it relevant or I might not. I might put it into student-friendly language or I might not. And so effectiveness theory says we want to see these things on a continuum. And so if right now, after Karen does an observation of me, I'm currently in needs improvement relative to how I'm communicating with students, then she has particular feedback to me that's kind of needs improvement-ish. I didn't totally bomb it, but it wasn't an exemplar for how to present an objective. And so if we're not saying you're at level 1 on a 4-point scale, then I might not necessarily look at a rubric and say, here's what I need to do next in order to improve. So that's effectiveness theory. Again, I totally see the utility in being able to give feedback to a teacher without the number for a bunch of like rapport building reasons. So I think we hear this. I think like there was significant clapping after you spoke, right? And that means that people are supporting it. And so the team knows it. Do you have anything to add on this?
Yeah, I would say I definitely.
Good morning. What I'm struggling with, especially with something you just said, was in terms of setting that cut score. All right, so for argument's sake, I'm a teacher. I'm a high school math teacher. You give me some struggling group of students, I give them a baseline assessment, we decide what the cut score is. But also as a teacher, because I would say I'm fairly effective, my level of rigor also increases as my students get used to my classroom. So I don't start off, it's tough in the beginning as where we're going to be by the end of the year. But when they get that baseline assessment, they may perform well. But what if that cut score is not where, because if the rigor goes up as the school year goes up, who says that that cut score will move at the same rate? If you understand what I'm saying. So a student comes in, they perform well, or maybe they don't perform so well, right? But the rigor is also increasing. So as I'm making it more difficult, it's not like they're taking the same test. Now, if I give them the same test at the end, am I giving them the same I'm not giving them the same baseline test at the end of the year. I'm giving them something relative to the rigor of where I'm teaching, or do I just decide a new test that at least is at the same level of rigor?
So good question, great question. So the theory behind a pre-test, post-test is that the test should be the same level of rigor, right? So I'm getting my blood checked in September. I'm going back to my doctor, I'm getting my blood checked in May. We're seeing if it changed at all. The test is the same. It's looking for the same, is my glucose level under 100 whatevers, right? And so it's the same test in the pre-test and post-test. So let's use an ELA example just for a moment. So if we're looking at something like a 5th grade essay where people need to write a 5-paragraph essay with 3 pieces of evidence, that rubric, that assessment or that expectation is remaining the same in November and in March. The prompt that we give students to write about should change so that they're not writing about the same exact thing. But the level of rigor should remain the same, and we're looking at growth relative to the same level of rigor.